Okay, so welcome to the St. Louis Angular lunch, everyone. If you're not here for Angular, well, you might be a little bit disappointed. Up front, we noticed an asymmetry in the room, so it's like maybe like a wedding where one of them has friends and the other doesn't. We're not sure what it would mean in this context. But this week's topic, or this month's topic, is going to be ng-conf, the kind of most, I guess it's the #1 conference, the kind of the main US Angular conference of the year, which happened a couple weeks ago, which several of us were at. And we're going to do a panel discussion with John Bauer, who was not there moderating, keeping us all on the straight and narrow and concise. So I'm sure John will solicit questions from everybody here, as well as probably has his own questions. And since he's the moderator, he gets to decide what happens in what order. So take it away, John.
All right, well, I don't want to sit next to that speaker. Okay, as the moderator, I'm going to kick it off to you guys. What was your biggest gain from ng-conf? What did you walk away with saying, this was awesome?
Unfortunately, the things that come to mind are not actually technical. It's really the community and the people that you meet and the people that you get to know. This was my third ng-conf, and so now I'm actually at the point that as I'm walking down the hall, I see people and I recognize people. And some of them are developers from other companies, and some of them are people who just got off stage. And so it is a really nice thing that the community puts a lot of focus on not just the technology, but also the community and making sure that the thought leaders and the Angular core team are accessible and will talk to you. In terms of the technology, the main impression I get from it, it's not like this is an awesome thing, but the main impression I got from the conference was that Angular is stable. Kind of boring, if you want to think of it that way. But there weren't huge announcements. There were a few things here and there. There are some changes that will come out in version 8 later this month, and we can talk about some of those things. But overall, it is really more the community is figuring out how to use the tools that we already have, and not the 3 years ago when Angular 2 just came out and the community didn't know what had just dropped in their laps.
Okay, so I'm going to give a similar answer to last year and copy yours. That boring is actually getting to be the best feature.
Stability is underrated.
Angular works, and it still works, and all my old programs still work. And I can add new stuff without breaking the old stuff, and that is just wonderful. It's maybe not as exciting as like, major, hey, we're going to do everything differently than we did, but it is really fantastic. Also, like the platform being built on Angular, there's more and more focus to the platform being built above and around Angular. It's like just making a component is old hat by now, and it's just great to see this ecosystem and community building up that we can build. Like big companies can build big futures on.
Yeah, I got to agree. The community is my favorite aspect of Angular. There are new things coming. I think we expected some of those new things to have already arrived by now, but I'd much rather they be right than be fast. I'm surprised I'm the first person to mention the I word, Ivy. Ivy is coming. Ivy will enable a whole bunch of really cool things inside of Angular, but it's not here yet. 8 is where it's available. 9, I think, is where it's going to be the default. And ideally, we won't see huge changes outside, like the way we use the framework. We'll just see better performance, and then gradually over time, the presence of Ivy will enable things that, frankly, I think will kind of harken back to the days of the more dynamic AngularJS ways that we had of building applications. Because as much as I love Angular, there are some things that are still quite difficult to do in Angular, especially on the more dynamic end of things. And Ivy should re-enable, or at least begin to allow us to re-enable some of that stuff. So there's quite a bit of conversation around Ivy, but again, it's not there yet. The biggest feature by far of Angular right now is the fact that it is a platform you can build on top of. You can trust it to be stable. The ecosystem is growing up around it. And that's great, because for a long time it's been, oh, what new framework was invented this week? And let's throw out everything we did last year, burn it all down, and start over again. And that is not the way Angular works. That's not the way that the world is shaping up around Angular, and I think that's a huge, huge win.
And actually, I forgot something. We should introduce ourselves. Sure. I'm Lance Finney. I'm a developer with Oasis Digital and an instructor with Angular Bootcamp, and I've presented here a couple times before.
I'm Kyle Cordes, also a teacher at Angular Bootcamp, developer at Oasis Digital, technical guru, hopefully. And I'm going to take this moment to plug Paul Spear's evening St. Louis Angular meetup. Paul could not be here with us today. I believe he is assisting a customer with important stuff right now. But please come a week from Thursday night to the St. Louis Angular meetup. And we have some little pieces of paper over here on a side table if anybody doesn't have information about that to get a link to that.
I'm Bill Odom. You guys know who I am.
All right, I'm actually going to come over and grab this microphone here because I've had the luxury of being around you guys for the past 2 weeks, and so I don't know all the good questions to ask. I already heard you talk about them. So I'd like to see if anybody in the audience has any questions to ask. Anything you want to hear about what happened at ng-conf?
One of the new things I did see was Builder. I don't know much about it. I just saw kind of a little a blurb somewhere, and it gave a little paragraph. I don't know if they talked about that at all. I believe it was you could more easily configure Webpack or something, maybe. I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay, so builders, that's a concept from CLI. They have made the bit of machinery that runs in Angular CLI that knows how to convert some chunk of source code to some chunk of output. They've made that pluggable. Now, of course, the default one plugged in uses Webpack, but it doesn't even have to use Webpack. And so the exciting innovation that I think I heard mentioned just a couple of times at the conference is Angular CLI, you could maybe think of that as CLI, because there's really no longer any obstacle to making a CLI builder and schematic to let you build your non-Angular stuff with CLI if you wanted to. I predict we'll see some exciting talks about that next year, but I just saw a few mentions of it this year, so I wouldn't hold your breath if you're like eager for it.
Yeah, one of the things I think right now in the Angular ecosystem that really hasn't kind of come into its own yet is schematics and the things that are related to schematics. I don't know if you folks know who Manfred Steyer, but he's one of like the experts around schematics. Has a book on schematics, and I had dinner with him right before the conference started, and I said, "Hey, yeah, I got your book, and I really enjoyed it." And he's like, "Oh, you're the one." But schematics are phenomenally powerful, and you couple them with things like the new builders. People are really not yet taking advantage of this stuff. I don't think people have realized what you can do yet with schematics. It's not just, oh, I want a slightly different blueprint for my components, so I'll create a schematic around that. They're full-blown code transformation. You can really do just about anything with schematics, and it's not just limited to Angular. So in much the same way that the Angular CLI is kind of becoming the CLI, same thing with some of the pieces that go to make it up. And I really hope the community starts taking advantage of it. I know that internally on some projects, we've already started talking about, what would it look like to put together schematics to kind of meta-enable some of the project development that we're working on. And I think that could be phenomenally powerful. So again, just beginning to see some movement on that. My hope is that people will begin to pick that up and run with it, and some of the folks here, I hope, are some of the ones that run with it. For example, here's something I want. Feel free to invent this and then send me a note when you did it, because I need it. I want refactoring schematics. I want the ability to say, crap, I should have named this differently when I created it, and run my refactoring schematic, and it goes through and finds all the places where I've used a component and changes the selector name accordingly and changes all the class names accordingly and like fixes all the things that I would have to go and manually fix. That, to me, that seems a very natural application for schematics, and as far as I know, it doesn't exist yet. So hopefully soon.
I will interject on behalf of the Angular CLI team. Pull request welcome.
And if you are more interested in schematics, there were 2 talks on the second day by Brian Love and someone else who he works with. I forget the other guy's name. One was a short talk, and one was a 2-hour or 2-hour workshop. So almost all of the talks from ng-conf are available on YouTube on the ng-conf channel. So if you can go out there and see those. There's nothing at all like that for builders. It's just too new of a concept.
They get those talks out ridiculously fast, so definitely take advantage of it.
Yeah, so speaking of the talks, I'm sure I kind of gave you a softball at the beginning. I'm sure it wasn't 3 days of everybody getting up and saying, hey, Angular still works. There are probably new, cool things. So just tell me about one of the talks you saw that really stuck with you and maybe people should go watch. Maybe somebody was really, maybe somebody gave this awesome workshop on Angular material or blew your mind with CSS Grid.
I'm going to steal this one before anybody else gets to. The StackBlitz guys are launching a rocket into space with a web server on it. It's kind of hard to beat that. I was sitting in chat when I think you were in the audience and I was actually working on my talk, but I'm like I gotta pause long enough to see what Eric and Albert are going to do, and after Eric made the announcement, Kyle popped in the chat. Well, we're done now. Everybody else can just go home. They're launching a web server into space. How are you going to top that? The funniest part of that to me, though, is the part you didn't see on stage. Aaron was joking as he was introducing Eric Simon. He's like, Eric's super nervous about this. He's got no reason to be nervous. These guys always do such amazing demos and amazing talks. StackBlitz is incredible, and everybody knows it. So I have no reason to be nervous whatsoever. And I talked to Eric later. He's like, yeah, what you don't know is that Albert was back in the hotel room pushing while I was walking up the steps onto the stage. It had literally never worked before, and he was pushing changes that I was about to demo on stage for the first time. He's like, I had a reason to be nervous. I'm like, wow, man, you must clang when you walk.
So I think I know why he wanted to intercept the microphone first. It's because actually Bill's talk is one of the talks that I really think that we should pay attention to. And John hinted at it. Bill gave a 2-hour workshop on CSS Grid, and just as developers, as framework developers, we tend to focus on the JavaScript and leave the CSS and say that's just too kind of weird and complicated. Watch Bill's talk. It's CSS Grid, get ready to fall in love, and a lot of us did. It really was impressive to see what you can do with CSS now. And it's not just, you have to figure out these arcane things and hope that it works right this way versus that browser. Like, there's new standards that really make life easier, and Bill is incredibly entertaining on stage, as you have probably already seen here. So I really do recommend that. And it's not just because he's a coworker. It was a really good talk.
Thank you. I've heard that at least one person publicly admitted to it being life-changing.
They didn't say it was good life-changing. It's like
And,
my life was different.
and I'm confident that if I had interviewed people in the audience, I would have found at least one moved to tears. I didn't, but I'm confident I could have. It was really good. Okay, but
Harry made a. See, this is one of those life-changing things you're talking about. I can't tell if it's good or bad because after Harry saw a preview version of the talk, he's like, well, crap. Now I got to go rewrite everything I've ever written.
okay, but my actual answer is, I think it was a Misco on the morning of the third day, talked about they had a lot of very reassuring words because they had ideas that could point to a really interesting future. And they did a really great job reassuring all of us that they will not break existing code by moving to this future. You can tell there's a certain amount of scar still there from the Angular 1 to 2 transition. But the thing we have to remember to the community is that was actually kind of a long time ago in programmer years, which are kind of like dog years. But they still remember, and they vigorously promised not to break the world as they go create an amazing future. But they have some stuff that's really sort of pushing the envelope of what is possible to do in terms of like loading only the code you absolutely have to load when you need to load it. And I think that if that future materializes, it could be a really big leap ahead of what anybody else is even talking about.
Another talk that comes to mind is not about something that's big in the future, but I think was a really good talk about helping to explain how to use well what we already have, and that was Deborah Carrada's talk. And unfortunately, I don't remember the name of it, but it was on the first day. What's that? Yeah, she gave an RxJS talk about how to do RxJS well and how to really think about it. There were quite a few talks about thinking reactively, and some of them were good, and some were other talks. But Deborah's was one that was had a really good way of laying out the way to think about observables and the way to create your pipelines and how to pull things together. There are quite a few other ones on subjects and things like that, but that is the one that I would look at in particular if you are aware of RxJS but it hasn't sunk yet. Give that a view.
All right, kick it off. Anybody else have a question they'd like to ask the panel? Let's see.
What did you hear, if anything, about Cypress? And is it going to be, more officially a part of Angular anytime?
I will answer part of that from the technical end, and then I'm going to hand it to maybe Bill to answer from a community adoption end, or maybe Lance. Okay. So there was a lot of discussion of Cypress, and some of that discussion is sort of an implication that, Cypress is the new thing, you must all use it now. But that actually led me to go learn about Cypress and try to really understand what's really different about it than Protractor, which is kind of the long blessed technology for this purpose. And so I will not launch into an hour talk at this moment explaining the difference, but it really is a very significant difference. It's not just a newer thing, it's significantly different in a way that might be better or worse, depending on what you're trying to do. Then I will hand it over to Lance, who seemed to have words on adoption and that sort of issue.
So there were two parts of your question. One was there stuff about Cypress? Yes, there was a talk on the second day that Joe Eames and Jesse Sanders gave, a 1-hour workshop on Cypress. It was kind of a comedy routine, straight man, so I was there for about half of it. I don't know how much actual information was imparted, but it was funny. In terms of whether it will be officially adopted, it was stated during one of the keynotes that the Angular team is still focused on Protractor, and they are still working on Protractor, and it will be what ships with the CLI. So it wasn't stated a lot. It was just the one reference. So Protractor isn't going away, at least not anytime soon. However, as other people have noted, if you're using NX on top of the CLI, so the CLI by default uses Karma and Protractor, and so a lot of people are sticking with those because that's what the CLI uses. But if you use NX on top of the CLI, that gives you options when you're installing things, and so it's really easy if you're using NX to use Jest instead of Karma, or to use Cypress instead of Protractor. So I don't know where the community is going to go, but the official core team is still sticking with Protractor.
Yeah, I can't tell you whether Cypress is going to somehow, supplant Protractor. I don't really think so. I think it's actually better that there is a growing ecosystem of these kinds of tools. And I can also tell you that certainly the way that we've used Protractor on some internal projects is less and less Angular specific. One of the big, marquee features of Protractor back in the AngularJS days was that it was aware it was testing AngularJS applications. So you could put in things like, make sure that the digest cycle has settled before you try to do something. And that was great for its time, but in practice, certainly with Angular 2 and beyond, it hasn't seemed to work as well. So the way that we use Protractor is just about the way we'd use just any other end-to-end testing tool without a lot of Angular-specific awareness inside. And I think that's good. Ideally, you want your testing tool to be able to test your application in, if not a black box fashion, kind of a dark gray box fashion, which Protractor was never really about. So what that means is it's more realistic nowadays to use things other than just Protractor with Angular applications, Cypress being one of those things.
Who else has a question for our great panel here?
The dude here in the front was not impressed by the great panel.
Now, when version 8 comes out in a couple weeks and kind of Ivy's there, but in preview, it wasn't really quite clear to me, but in you guys' opinion, would that be a safe time to start using Ivy at that point in time, or would you actually wait until 9?
Safe is a strong word.
I guess for the projects you start, would you enable Ivy?
I can answer that. So we are bleeding edge people. So absolutely, absolutely we will. Furthermore, like, it is hard to explain unless you've been like kind of following the, haunting the people around in their discussions and chats and in hallways and so on for years, just how high of a bar there is for something to go into Angular. Like, if it's in there, you can probably assume you can use it. We've tried switching a few small things and it just worked trivially. By the time it's out there for you to flip a switch, it's probably going to work in your app without any effort. But on the other hand, if your compile size doesn't matter, then, which is true for many enterprise apps, you may not even bother to look at the switch and just say, I'll get it when it becomes default. I don't even care about it.
Yeah, the reason Ivy is not the default right now is 2%. Internal to Google, they're at about 98% tests passing with Ivy as the renderer. Now, like Kyle was saying, the bar for something going into Angular is really, does it break anything inside of Google? The hundreds or thousands of applications that are written in Angular inside of Google are the things that all have to work. And if you're not familiar with the way that software development happens inside of Google, it is the ultimate in dogfooding. If the Angular team pushes a change to Angular that breaks anybody's Angular application, the Angular team is on the hook for going and fixing those applications. So literally, they could break hundreds or thousands of apps inside of Google, and it becomes their new life to go fix them all if they break them. So they care very, very much about not breaking those applications. And there's about 2% of tests that don't yet pass in the giant Google environment, at least as of 2 weeks ago when I was talking with Rob and Igor about this. And until they get up to the threshold, which is north of 99%, they're not going to make this the default. They're not going to push it out. But for those of us out here outside of Google, yeah, Ivy is in fantastic shape. So starting a new project with it wouldn't make me nervous. Experimenting with it on an existing project just to see if you happen to run any of those any of those breakages, absolutely worth doing. I expect it to be kind of a non-issue when it does become the default, which again harkens back to how badly the transition from AngularJS to Angular 2 happened. I think that's proving to be one of the most valuable things that happened in the history of Angular, because it has meant that the curation, the shepherding of the framework is incredibly careful at this point. I don't think they would have been nearly so careful if that hadn't happened early in the history. Since it did, we're getting all sorts of good stuff, but we're getting it in a very, very measured, stable fashion. Ivy is a good example of that.
I don't remember which core team member I heard this from, but apparently those 2% of tests or 2% of projects that have tests, whatever it is, the problems that are being exposed by those tests are actually not things that are seen in the production apps. It's that the tests were relying on timing issues that don't matter to the actual browser, but they were just relying on them. And so they're trying to figure out how to work with Ivy so that it does things that don't actually matter for production in order to not break the test. So from what we heard, Ivy is production ready. It's just there's some tests that are written in a way that they have to fix those tests. But I would agree with them that, new project, give it a shot.
And another question over here.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, if we've been talking about Ivy a lot, was there anything in particular that you can think of that you learned about Ivy at ng-conf that you guys didn't already know? And if not, could you guys maybe do like a little bit of a rundown of some of the major differences between the existing renderer and Ivy?
I'll grab the low-hanging fruit. I can't promise I learned this at ng-conf because I think I might have actually read discussion about it a few weeks before. Okay, sorry about that. Did you hear me? Okay. Oh, I guess it didn't happen on the video, so oh well. Anybody else? Okay.
Last Ivy one, or for me anyway. Were there any talks demoing new features that will be available because of Ivy or anything like that? I looked around a little bit. I couldn't find any.
That's the future. There's a lot that will be enabled by Ivy, but until it's turned on by default, they're just not really going to be available because it's going to be optional. So with 9, who knows? There might be a whole world, or that world might only be exposed in 10 after the community's had some time to live with it. What we have heard is that a lot of the Angular team, even people who normally wouldn't be working on something like Ivy, have been pulled in to work on Ivy to fix these bugs and to fix these issues and to fix the tests, not bugs. So a lot has been focused in getting this out because it's kind of a bottleneck for a big, wide future that has been promised, but unfortunately we don't really know what is in that big, wide future.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Hello. I'm not really an Angular developer, but I've worked as architect and many places, and still I hear talks about versions of 1.1 and AngularJS 2, and so which is the most widely used? Because like I thought Angular 7 is stable, and if I just want to find out like if everyone is in the right path or why they are not adopting to the higher versions or they're still sticking with the lower versions.
In terms of like which major version number of Angular is most widely used, I don't actually know what that number would be. Just to level set here, when we're talking about AngularJS and Angular, a lot of people refer to that as like Angular 1 and Angular 2. In reality, Angular 2 is way in the rearview mirror at this point. We're on, major version release 7, about to be on major version release 8. The Angular team releases these major versions on about a 6-month cycle, and they promise, and so far they've held to it, that they're only going to do breaking changes on that 6-month cycle. So there's still a lot of AngularJS 1.x out in the world. The last version of AngularJS, the one prior to Angular 2 and beyond, is 1.7. And 1.7 is end of life for AngularJS. They're doing like mostly security fixes. If they have a problem in AngularJS that manifests in major browsers and is a security issue, they'll do fixes for that, but no new features. AngularJS is done. Angular 2 and beyond, where we are now, we're currently on version 7, but the difference between version 4, version 5, version 6, version 7 is kind of like point releases of AngularJS. So even though it's a major version number change every 6 months, in reality, it's been extremely easy to upgrade across major versions. We do the Angular Bootcamp class. There's 60 to 70 small applications as part of that curriculum, and typically upgrading across major versions is a lazy afternoon's work, and even sometimes it's 20 minutes. It's like, yep, everything still works. All the end-to-end tests still work. We're good. The difference between like version 5 and 6 was a little more difficult because there was an RxJS change that we had to go in and like actually change some syntax. But in general, upgrading across major releases of Angular has been a breeze. And because of that, one of the things the Angular team strongly encourages people to do is keep up to date. And we do the same thing. There is really not a great reason not to stay up to date on major releases of Angular. It's really easy to upgrade typically. And if you upgrade when a major release comes out, it is much easier to do a single major release upgrade than it is to do several at one time. The Angular team also provides an upgrade website where you can go and say, I'm going from 6.1 to 7.0, and it'll tell you everything that you need to care about in that upgrade. And usually it's very obscure stuff, and it's just basically a checklist of, am I doing any of these weird things? Nope, great, upgrade. And then you run all your tests, and everything's great. So we've had a very, very straightforward time, pretty easy time upgrading across major versions. So when version 8 comes out, we'll be teaching version 8 the next day.
I can also answer directly one little piece of your question. The the highest number dot version of every version of Angular is very stable. So what is it? 1.7 dot whatever is extremely stable. The final 2 dot whatever is extremely stable. The final 4 dot is extremely stable, and so on. So if you want to know what's the stable version, as long as you're on like the end of whatever major version you're on, it is very stable and very debugged. Also, Angular Master is also very stable, and it's in fact a totally workable strategy, although none of us have had the courage yet on a customer project to simply say we run on, we continuously update to current Angular Master, because the way their internal process works, they have to go through the process build described before, right? So stuff that lands published as Angular Master already works on all of Google's Angular code.
Quite literally, if it's good enough for Google, it's probably good enough.
Yeah. I mean, I think we heard one of their people. They've now publicly stated they have over 1,000 applications inside Google on Angular. I think I heard them say that from the stage. One of them.
Moderators.
So we've had a lot of Ivy questions, a lot of Ivy talk. Obviously, that's been the big Angular 8 or 7 or Ivy's coming. Was there anything else that came out from the actual Angular team? I know a lot of people give talks on interesting concepts, but is there anything else from the Angular team to indicate other big things that are coming in Angular that weren't Ivy related?
So I can kind of point obliquely to one. So going back to that talk I mentioned is my favorite talk of the whole thing, pointing to a possible future. Right now, Angular is very neutral on many, many things, particularly on state management. So there's this like thriving community of different state management approaches. There's like 3 or 4 like kind of major state management libraries and many more narrower community ones. But some of the ideas they have in mind to make Angular applications more incrementally loadable would require that Angular have an official, at least some aspects of state management would have to become like an official thing you adopt to get those benefits. And so there is a possible future of Angular where there is some aspect of state management in the box instead of only in the community.
Even with that, I would expect it to be as conservative as it can possibly be. One of the conversations I remember having with Rob Wormald a couple of years ago now was, once he joined the Angular team, I'm like, cool, does that mean that, your state management stuff is going to officially become part of the framework? And he's like, no, I made it a condition of my employment that had to stay independent. I'm like, dear God, why? And he's like, I would much rather Angular, the framework, be instrumented to support an ecosystem of these solutions and let the community come up with the best solution and then another best solution later than to seal it in concrete and build it into the framework in such a way that there was only one way to solve this particular problem. So even if they do start having to address part of this in order to enable other things in the framework, I expect it's going to hew more to that instrumentation side and enabling side than it will be to there is one and only one true solution for state management in Angular proper. That is not the way that the Angular team seems to do things. It's certainly not the way that Rob wants it to be done. And even though Mishko and Rob don't always align exactly on their opinions, they're very much on the same team and of like mind about keeping the framework relevant to the people who use it.
All right, we've probably got time for one more question, and I've already asked like 3, so it's not fair for me to do another one. All right, I'll do another one.
You can always call on anyone who works.
I could do that.
You can just call on any of your
I
coworkers.
could do that.
All of the Oasis digital people get
But I'm a believer in karma, so I'm not going to.
You know what we haven't heard anything about is like what was happening outside the rooms.
What was happening outside the rooms?
Well, let me start first. I'm not curious what you're talking about, and then I'll build on that.
Well, I mean, the hallway track was thriving. I walked around a lot during the event, and there were many, many people talking in hallways. There were many vendor booths and people talking at them. I would say that there's definitely a very strong hallway track. I know that a couple of us talked about there's kind of like a little bit different feel each year. I'm trying to think, what did we say about the feel? There's something a little bit different about there was a different about the buzz in the hallway, and I don't remember what that difference was.
Yeah, I mean, the feel that I got was just that it was calmer, that it's more settled. Also, some of the particular personalities that are well known to really like enliven things just happened not to make it this time. So we didn't have Bonnie, and if you know Bonnie. Shai Resnick was not there. Bonnie Brennan wasn't there, and so just some particular personalities who always enliven the room didn't happen to be there. But there were still a lot of other people. They still had full sponsorships. They had a lot of our competitors and a lot of product companies and a lot of other groups were there. They didn't have as many parties as they sometimes have in the past. Sponsors apparently are not ponying up as much for free alcohol for people, and so we survived. But there was still karaoke 2 nights, and that was a lot of fun. Heather is in the back. Heather participated in karaoke. Well done, Heather. So there's a lot of ng-conf that is about fun and community. There's a lot that's just going on everywhere. In addition to the main talks that are scheduled and you can predict and see what's coming up before you get there. They also, on the 3rd floor of the hotel, have rooms where they have Ask Me Anything sessions with speakers. So, if there's a particular speaker you want to talk to, the speakers are contractually obligated to sit in a room for an hour and answer your questions. They also, or maybe half hour, I don't remember. They also have speaker panels where they bring 4 or 5 speakers together to answer questions, or 8 speakers, or whatever the number happened to be. So there are a lot of other things like that. There was also, what was it this year? Mindfulness. There was like a mindfulness meditation session. I didn't participate in it. So there's a lot of other things going on that help build the community and help really bring home that the people who are on stage are not gods that you have to worship. They're other developers who are contractually obligated to talk to you.
Yeah, one of the things that I've mentioned many, many times, and I think it's a really important point. If you ever see Brad Green, the head of the Angular team, at a conference, he's almost certainly going to be wearing what used to be a black T-shirt that says "You can sit with us," and now it's kind of a faded gray because he wears it to every conference. And it is kind of the informing principle of the Angular community that it's all us. It's not the Angular team up on Mount Olympus, and you must pay fealty. No, it's very much we're you. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the Angular team is how accessible they are. They hit a lot of these conferences, and the reason for that is so that you can go and talk to them. My favorite part, as I said on the Angular podcast, which I don't think has been published yet, my favorite part of the conference was the 2 a.m. conversation I had with Rob and Igor and Frosty in the hotel lobby, because one, these are my friends. I really like them. I like hanging out with them. I like to get to see them. But also, that stuff is incredibly valuable. Hearing Igor talk about why they are doing things that they're doing in the framework so that some other group within Google will be able to not run out of file handles on a Linux system in June. Like, they are in a race against time to make sure that Angular is up to date so that this gigantic project won't hit its build limit. Like, wow, that's amazing. And you learn so many valuable things, gain so many valuable insights just by being able to have these informal hallway conversations with the people who are actually building this tool that I depend on in my daily life. It's kind of funny. I sometimes wish they didn't record all of the talks, because then I'd be forced to go actually sit in them as opposed to do the hallway track. But given the fact that they do record everything and post it up on YouTube, means that I can actually focus on the community aspects. I can focus on the hallway tracks, knowing that I'll always be able to catch a talk after the fact. Every now and again I miss a really cool talk that I wish I had been in the room for, but overall it's a pretty good trade. The community of Angular is arguably its best feature. These conferences, if you go to them and you only go to the talks and you don't engage with the community, you are missing 75% of the reason to be there.
All right, well, I think that's about our allotted time here. So thank you, Bill, Kyle, Lance, for your insights. And if anybody has any more questions, catch these guys or any of us walking around after lunch. So thank you.